Hey friends, welcome back to another Salt City Hoops podcast. Let's talk some Jazz basketball. My name is Mark Pereira, as always here with you every week to talk about the latest happenings in the NBA and the Utah Jazz and what continues to be a really fun season. I've said it every week now, and I've made this comment every week that it's been every week. But it's been a very fun Jazz season. We've actually had a number of things happen this week that have been fun for the Jazz. Very close loss against the Oklahoma City Thunder on the road. We just finished, I'm recording this on Thursday night, we just finished off a pretty exciting home win against the Dallas Mavericks. Blowout loss against the Blazers. And we're going to talk about not so much the games this week because we have some wider NBA news to talk about, and with the recent Trae Young trade, and I want to talk about the implications of that trade for the Utah Jazz, and maybe we'll get into a little bit of the specific games when I talk about our second topic today, which is the Jazz rotation and the rotational quirks from game to game. As a fantasy basketball guy, and I'm not a gambler anymore on sports, but I know it's also a gambling point of interest for many, is what the hell is the Jazz rotation from night to night and how do we figure it out? And right as I started to have my pulse on what they do when certain players are resting, even when odd players are resting, like when Keontae George rested against the Clippers, and when Svi Mikhailuk, he's rested a couple games, including tonight against the Mavericks, I kind of have a finger on my pulse. I'm like, okay, here's kind of who is playing when. All of a sudden, Kyle Anderson plays 20-plus minutes and closes the game tonight, and not in like a backup center role. So I want to get into the things I've noticed about the rotation over the past couple weeks to kind of help us as Jazz fans understand what is constant and what is fluid, and what is something that what are things to rightfully be frustrated about, and things, not that I'm trying to judge you one way or another as a fan how you want to, but things that are very obviously a little bit frustrating. I'm frustrated alongside with you, and maybe some other things that actually have an undercurrent of explanation that may make us feel a little bit better. So, want to tackle those two particular things today as we talk about the rotations. Might sprinkle in some of the stat lines of and encouraging or discouraging performances over the past few games against Portland and Dallas and Oklahoma City. Maybe we'll get into last week's as well. Because last time we spoke, I don't think we touched upon the Warriors game, so we might touch upon that road loss against the Warriors, where the Jazz were winning in the third quarter and couldn't hold on, but they only lost by 9 on the road, which is pretty good for them. And we'll, of course, at some point during today's show, we'll talk about the tank picture for the Jazz, which is affected by the Washington Wizards, longtime dregs of the league for the entire season. The Washington Wizards were not really a threat to Utah as far as like their place in the standings. It seemed like Washington was pretty clear a top 3 lottery team, and they really didn't have a path to getting better than that. And Utah was just, they have some better players, they have some perhaps better coaching, they have a little bit more stability right now, and Utah was going to be picking in that 5 to 8 range. Well, first of all, before the Trae Young trade, Washington was playing like 500 basketball for a couple weeks there. I think they went 6-5 or 5-6 or something like that, and they're sitting at 10-26, while Utah sitting at 13-24. And I actually audibly laughed today when I saw, I think it's Bullets Forever is one of the Washington Wizards blogs. They wrote an article worrying about losing their draft pick because the Wizards, lest we forget, also owe a top 8 protected pick. And I'm already forgetting who it belongs to. I forget if it's the Knicks. I'm going to quickly look that up while we sit here. Always makes for great radio. But it absolutely was. Yeah, it's they owe it to the Knicks, and that was part of I believe the Jalen Duren draft day trade, if I recall correctly. I haven't thought of this in a long time, But yeah, so it does go to the Knicks. So I audibly laughed when I saw an article from the Wizards blog, Bullets Forever, that by trading for Trae Young, they are now worried about losing their top 8 protected pick because they, like as I mentioned, they've been playing better basketball as of late. So now it's like, oh, now we're adding Trae Young to the mix. He had a fake injury for a couple weeks for the Atlanta Hawks. He's probably healthy and ready to go. We'll see. And the reason I laugh is because, guys, no, the Wizards are not going to lose their draft pick. If they have to send Trae Young out to Norway, to the fjords of Norway all winter, like they'll do that. They'll do whatever it takes to not win basketball games. Like Utah, Washington is having a recent problem of their young players playing really good basketball. I was a big Bub Carrington fan coming out of the draft. He's in his second year, and he looks a lot better. He perhaps not, maybe doesn't top out as like a starting quality of point guard, but he definitely looks pretty competent out there, and he's had a great couple of weeks. Alex Sard looks like, and obviously should have been the number 1 overall pick for the Hawks, regardless of their status with Onyeka Okongwu on the roster. Like, Alex Sard looks incredible out there. Keyshawn George, I think, is an underrated most improved player candidate. I know it's like, oh, he's a young player, he's a first-round pick, whatever. He should be ineligible for most improved player discussions, but he looks awesome out there, right? And so, like, they're winning because of young players playing well. And that is the reason it's exciting for them is, yeah, you're not going to lose your draft pick. You don't have to worry about the young players playing that well. You should be excited, though, that good things are happening, that you're not completely garbage out there. And so we might get into the broader tanking position picture later, but I think it is interesting that it leads right into this discussion of the top 8 protected pick, and now Washington is also now concerned about it because they have added, I don't think Trae Young is as good as Lauri Markkanen, of course, not even close, but they've added like a heavy dose of competence where they didn't have it before, especially at the point guard spot. Like I said, I'm positive on Bub Carrington. I think he's a nice little player. I think he's been worse than I was kind of hoping, but he's also a ball-handling guard. Sometimes it takes a while for them. But Trae Young is an immediate improvement on Bub Carrington in a number of respects. So I want to talk about just my opinions on the Trae Young trade because why not? It's, again, I'm here to discuss with you and what your opinions are, and I will always say I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the Trae Young trade? And also, I think there's some important implications for the Jazz as well, and how the Jazz think about roster building and the effects of the new CBA on roster building, and how the Jazz, now that we have some young players who are going to get paid going forward, Walker Kessler first among them this summer, then it'll be Keontae George coming out of nowhere, who's going to command, I don't know, man, $30-40 million, right? Like, we'll see. And what the Jazz need to consider going forward to build a playoff contending roster, where you need to have, in order to be competitive in today's NBA, you need to have some bargains on your team. You need to have some bargains. And Oklahoma City is about to run into that issue. You're allowed to keep your team together. It's going to come at a cost. So, in general, the number one thing people are thinking is Trae Young gets traded to the Washington Wizards in a remarkably simple deal. Now, before I actually conclude that statement, I should end that sentence with a comma. The trade has not been called into the NBA office yet. Now, when a trade like this is announced, it doesn't mean that suddenly the trade is going to break down or necessarily. But by the Wizards and the Hawks agreeing to this particular area of principle, so it's Trae Young, it's a remarkably simple concept of a trade, I should say then, of Trae Young for CJ McCollum, who's on an expiring contract, veteran player, of course, and Corey Kispert, who's making $13 million as a slightly overpaid shooting swingman who is a little bit taller than you'd expect, but not hasn't exactly shown a ton, but is worth kind of being out there. Has another year left in his contract and then the team option after that. But the trade has not been called in, so that the only real thought that invites is both teams are probably canvassing the league on how to bring in a third or fourth team to make other roster improvements that they're perhaps looking at. And when the principles of the trade are agreed upon, you might take 24 to 48 hours to maybe think about, well, how can we make this even more advantageous from a tax perspective for a third team or something like that. So because once you get a trade together of the principles, it's a lot easier for teams to pick up the phone and say, do you want in on figuring out the structure, than it is for, let's say, a third or fourth team or whatever. If they have something that they need to get done, it's a lot harder if they're doing it one way, where if they call up the Wizards and say, hey, we have a way to give you a couple second round draft picks to help also take on this dump. We'll also take something from Atlanta for touching requirements or something like that. I'm making up random examples that are total straw men just to say that it's easier for teams to build a 3-team trade than it is to conclude this trade and then start new trades. So I think that's why the trade probably hasn't been called in. Probably as you're listening to this, it probably already has been. But I wanted to note that as I finished. Other quick quirks I like to note about these things, because when it comes to listeners of podcasts and things like that, I like to think that this is one of the things that I'll have a beat on for you as far as little minutia about getting trades done and everything. With Trae Young out of the picture, there's certainly value of CJ McCollum being in Atlanta, and Corey Kispert and Luke Kennard kind of have overlapping capabilities. Luke Kennard's already on the Hawks. They occupy similar roles in more ways than one, I suppose. But both of those players, while they may have some sort of a role on Atlanta as constructed, finish out the season as it is, Atlanta might have a reason to say, like, well, we don't actually need CJ McCollum. We don't actually need Corey Kispert. We have a reason to flip you guys to a different team in a trade later on down the road. The quirk I'm getting to that I want to note for you is that they cannot be aggregated into a trade with other players for a larger salary. So the Hawks can no longer combine McCollum and Kispert, or McCollum and anybody else on the roster, or Kispert and anybody else on the roster for a different player. They can't, that is something that cannot happen now that this trade has been done. So if you're thinking about, like, well, now that if you're building something in a trade machine or something like that, and now you're playing around with CJ McCollum's $30 million salary, and that's easier to wield than Trae Young's $49 million salary, well, just note that McCollum has to be traded by himself for something. So just something to keep in mind. So the trade itself, the first question everyone's going to have is, Trae Young has made all-star teams, scored a bunch of points, has had amazing playoff moments, and he's 27 years old. And he didn't fetch a single draft pick at all from the Wizards. In fact, it was threatened that the Wizards would only do the deal if the Hawks attached a pick to Trae Young, noting that Atlanta was desperate to get off of Trae Young's salary and Trae Young as a player. And so the Wizards is one of the very few suitors out there, if not the only. Even if they didn't even consider themselves a suitor, they might have been the only team willing to play ball with a conversation with Atlanta. So why is Atlanta so desperate to get rid of him, and why doesn't he fetch a draft pick? I'm going to talk about the more important part of this, I think, before I talk about the money part of this. The money part of this is probably more important to, like, the actual Atlanta Hawks, but I think for the purposes of discussing and how I like to think of this, what is more important, I think, to talk about in casual conversation, or more than casual conversation, is where a flawed player fits in today's NBA and how you build a team. And it becomes extremely fraught now to pay $1 quadrillion to someone who fits only a specific mold of play style. I think the Mikal Bridges trade has been a huge disappointment for New York, but the reason it wasn't completely insane, it was a little insane, maybe a lot insane, but not just completely insane for New York to trade as many draft picks as they did for Mikal Bridges, is because Mikal Bridges is going to play 82 games and he's going to play on every single lineup you can consist of. You play him 43 minutes on every single lineup. He's going to play. He's turned out to be more of a flawed player than I think New York anticipated. The guy just never gets to the free throw line. He shoots fewer threes than we anticipated. His assist rate's way down. All these things are having issues with Mikal Bridges, but you can start him with any lineup. Absolutely any lineup. And with Trae Young, his offense, his heliocentric offense, is good enough that, like, obviously he has to start. Especially at, his age and everything. He's lost a little bit of pop to some of his offensive game, but not horribly so. But it requires you to build. It basically takes 80% of roster possible players that you'd want to build a team with, and takes them off the table because they will not play capably with Trae Young. You want malleable, flexible lineups. And that doesn't mean like all 5 players they all kind of do 5 of the same different things and they're super blended. You're always going to have players who, in a radar graph, they're going to be doing different things with different strengths. That's going to be the nature of basketball. You have big guys, you have small guys, you have shooters, you have non-shooters. But Trae Young, his radar graph is so far to the extreme where the only way Trae Young is effective is if he has the basketball. And you've heard Zach Lowe lament for years, like, can the guy just learn how to run around a screen for once? Can he pull a little bit more Steph Curry style out of him where the game doesn't have to revolve around him dribbling the basketball? Is there something to that? And Trae Young just has no interest in doing that. He has just no interest in doing that. And he makes it known. That's not his game. So, a player like Trae Young is not a problem in a vacuum. He's so effing good. You want a player like that on your team, who of his skill and his quality. Like, he brings a lot to the table. But in a salary cap-based league, and this is getting into the money part of it, if he's going to be so difficult to build around, and you have a specific set of players that can only play with him and in a style of roster that you're going to build, he can't command 25, 30, 35% of the salary cap. 40% of the he can't be a max guy. At the time he signed his extension, I think there was still pretty strong whiffs around the NBA that perhaps heliocentrism is the way to play basketball. Have a James Harden. Have an Anthony Edwards. Anthony Edwards is much more of a malleable basketball player in the past 2 years than he was before. But at the time, Anthony Edwards, as an example, Trae Young. And so it wasn't a crazy extension at the time, but now you're looking at it saying, this is too hard. It's too hard to build around Trae Young. And he's making $50 million. On the flip side of the equation, you can look at a player like Karl Anthony Towns, who's slated to make, I think, almost $60 million or over $60 million. And he's got his own incredible flaws. And it makes building a roster really, really, really hard. So, not only is the $49 million of Trae Young difficult to trade to an actual basketball team because of salary matching reasons and a variety of other things, but teams, not only are they unwilling to just take on $49 million, both this year, and he has a player option for next year as well, so he'll definitely pick that up. unless he declines it because he's got some sort of big contract down the pike. Guess what? He probably doesn't, unless it's actually with the Wizards. So not only are teams struggling to pass the kidney stone of trading for $49 million, but for what? And that all of a sudden you slash 27 teams off of your list because they don't want a heliocentric tiny point guard who does not play defense. It's almost not even a can't or a want. He just doesn't. He does not play the defensive end of the court. I'm not going to get into that whole... That's annoying to talk about. Oh, Trae Young doesn't play defense. Okay, that's known. I'm not going to get into, like, what could he do better? His level of effort sucks. We don't got to get into it too much. It's been like that since Oklahoma. So then you're looking at the Kings, obviously the Wizards, and maybe the Nets as teams who could be interested in having an actual point guard on the team. Kings struggling with like their own salary situations. Like Zach LaVine is commanding a huge salary. They still got DeRozan on the books. Sabonis has a big salary. So there's no easy way for the Kings to have gotten Trae Young. It would have had to have been some sort of 3-team deal that's sending out LaVine somewhere. It just that those machinations weren't exactly going to work. Also, I'm pretty sure the Kings are trying to stealth tank right now and be as bad as possible. Sneaky bad. Stealth tank. I saw someone post the other day that, and I agree with this, that Scott Perry, their new GM, his signing of Drew Eubanks, Russell Westbrook, and Dennis Schroeder were actually his way of pretending to show competitiveness to Vivek, the owner. But those players are so bad that it actually meant that they were tanking. And I actually don't agree with that with Schroeder. Again, once again, he kind of baited everyone in from a great Team Germany performance into saying, like, getting, it's not a crazy contract. I think he makes something like $15 million a year. That's not insane. But Drew Eubanks, as we Utah Jazz fans know, was actively terrible last year and was a miserable watch. And Russell Westbrook just can't hate on a minimum signing for someone like that. But it is funny to think about that they stealth tanked by signing those three guys. Anyways, so you're left with the Wizards. This is the only real option here. So the number one issue the Hawks are facing is that they just don't have any suitors for someone to take on $49 million of Trae Young. Add in the fact that Atlanta is an ascending team. Without Trae Young, they're playing totally fine, good basketball. Not amazing, but they're being fine. Jalen Johnson is almost averaging a triple-double. He's averaging 8 assists a game, Jalen Johnson is. They have a Porzingis contract situation to figure out this summer, but like the Hawks have the Pelicans pick, which will be a top 3 lottery pick. The Pelicans have lost 9 straight after looking promising a couple weeks ago. The Hawks have a number of other draft assets going forward. Like the Hawks have a really good ascending team with good players on it right now. So they don't want Trae Young mucking up their salary situation. They want, even though he's a very good player, they wanted to get rid of him, and there's nobody who wanted to have him for basketball and salary reasons. And so you end up getting stuck. And I think the Hawks are fortunate that the Wizards are in the position that they're in. The Wizards actually have a reason for value for Trae Young. Get into that right now, I suppose, just real quickly. People have kind of debated back and forth, like, does Trae Young... surely Trae Young gets a lot of assists. Okay, great. Is he a great team basketball player? Is not something that Trae Young has always been good at. So while Trae Young can dribble, and dribble some more and find a way to get open shots for Keyshawn George and Alex Sarr and all that stuff, but I think there's some nuance to player development and capable point guard passing and everything. And I think, in my opinion, Trae Young is going to help table set a lot of things that the Wizards are not able to do right now, and get Trae Young more open shots and get Alex Sarr more lob dunks and whatever. But I'm not sure they're going to learn a whole lot in the development phase of things. And I could be wrong about this. I just feel like Trae Young is so far in the ball dominant side of things that I'm not sure you're going to be putting a lot of these guys in any more interesting situations other than they have more open shots that they just get to catch and shoot or dunk. Contra a player like Yusuf Nurkic on the Jazz, whose passing ability at his position opens up a lot more creative offensive sets from the Jazz of 5 different players moving around in different areas and different give and go situations with Keontae George. It's a style of passing that improves the connectivity of the offense. But I still come down to the fact that the Wizards just don't have a damn point guard. And if this was the final step that they were trying to take to get into playoff competitiveness next year, I would feel very skeptical about that. But they're looking around saying, we got, $80 million of cap space coming up? We got to spend it on something. And playing around with the idea of getting a real point guard in the building and scoring a little bit and passing the ball a little bit more than we can have, to give Trae Johnson more shots, to give Keyshawn George more shots, and to give Alex Sarr a little bit more functioning pick and roll learnings. It's just such a small bet to take for Washington that they're going to do it. So this all boils down to 0 suitors for Atlanta and Washington kind of having a remotely useful reason to have him. I promise you that this would come around to the Jazz at some point. Well, the one Jazz connection I immediately think of is, this feels immediately to me like the John Collins trade, where the Jazz were not a good basketball team. They're still rebuilding. They're looking for draft picks. And in the future, they're looking for high draft picks to get young players. And in the season immediately prior to the Ricochet draft and the Alex Sarr draft, Jazz looked around and said, we don't really care about finishing top 5 in lottery odds. The draft isn't important enough for that particular year. We can, for 0 cost to us, acquire John Collins and see if he's still an amazing quality player that he looked like in Atlanta, and perhaps we can right this ship sooner than later. John Collins turned out to be okay, and luckily for the Jazz, he didn't impact winning enough to affect our draft pick too much, as we well know this year. But coming around to a lot of the decisions the Jazz have coming forward, and especially with the Walker Kessler extension coming up this summer, or restricted free agency, I should say, it becomes more important, more than ever, to establish a middle class of salaries, or an upper middle class of salaries, to build a whole basketball team. Unless the player is so modular or so much of a superstar. Lauri Markkanen is the complete inverse of Trae Young. He is worth $50 million because you can play him in any lineup that you can possibly conceive of. He has 3-level scoring that he's demonstrated this year. He's added a little bit of independent capability, but he's a largely dependent threat, but he's showing what he can do if you just give him a little bit of advantage and a little bit of angles. Lauri Markkanen can put the ball on the deck and really abuse people. I thought it was notable that Lauri Markkanen was he was completely unbothered by any of the tall players of Oklahoma City, the Chet Holmgrens and such, that they were playing without Hartenstein, and you're all going to kill me for forgetting the Brandon Carlson. Completely unbothered by tall players, but he was really bothered by like Lou Dort and Aaron Wiggins. Lauri Markkanen fits in every lineup. And he's going to score in every lineup, and he's an average defender. Maybe below average this year, but I think, you put him out there, he's not going to kill you. Good effort. He has the highest steal rate of his career, by the way. It's not huge. Just something, as I'm doing research for these podcasts, sometimes I find little tidbits, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Highest steal rate of his career. It's like average for big men. I think he's averaging a steal a game this year. That's new for him. The Jazz have some polarizing players coming up. And the Walker Kessler extension, I think they should really fight to keep that salary as low as possible, because I think that the entire NBA is looking around and saying, we can't give $48 million, we can't give $60 million to players who will ruin our ability to build an entire roster around them. Because the salary, everyone's going to talk about ownership tax and ownership tax this and first apron, second apron, all these types of things as far as luxury tax payments. And rest assured, you will not hear any sympathy from me talking about owners needing to cut salary for luxury tax reasons for good teams. I don't want to hear anything about tax payments. But what the new CBA also introduces is a litany of roster prevention moves by expensive teams. If your team is over a certain salary, and I'm not going to get into all the nuances and minutia for you about, if you're over this apron, you can't do this or whatever. But if you're over given salary thresholds and you've made certain types of roster moves to get to that type of salary level, your team is not allowed to do certain roster moves. You can't aggregate players. You can't take more money in a trade than you send out. You can lose your first-round draft pick. Your first-round draft pick first gets frozen, and then it gets how good or bad your team is, your first-round draft pick goes to the end of the first round, which is not losing your first-round draft pick. I'm sorry. It's more like, okay, if you have a really expensive team and you finish 23rd, well, you don't get to pick 23rd, you pick 30th. It's all these roster building penalties for being an expensive team. Here's a really dumb example, and something that just has made me so furious with the current CBA. For reasons that are not worth getting into how they got there, the Warriors are hard capped at a certain amount, based on how expensive their team is and based on specific types of moves they made in the offseason. Using a mid-level exception, for example, is one of those things that can hard cap you at a certain salary amount. They had a need for some sort of bench veteran shooter who probably wasn't going to play, but someone they want on their team. And turns out Seth Curry was available. And they thought, all right, that's a good veteran presence to come around. We might even have reason, we have an injury-prone backcourt. Could be some reasons to have just a capable 10-minute, 15-minute, 8-minute veteran shooter that comes off the bench, and someone who's going to be comfortable not playing for 8 to 12 weeks at a time. Who knows? But because Seth Curry's been in the league for a number of years, his veteran minimum salary is higher than the typical 3 to 4 year veteran player. And so because his veteran minimum salary was so high, The Warriors had to wait a few weeks into the regular season to sign him so that his salary would be lowered down to a prorated amount that isn't his whole yearly salary, but rather his veteran minimum salary as it would be for like the remainder of the year for 70 games versus 82 games or something like that. And I just think it's so preposterous to me that the Warriors couldn't just sign a minimum player because of hard cap rules. And they're obviously still paying Draymond Green too much money. Jimmy Butler makes a ton of money for someone who is on the tail end of his career. The Warriors, part of the agreement with the Heat to get Jimmy Butler was going to get paid one more time. And everyone kind of looked around saying Jimmy Butler's not going to be worth one more time of payment. And you look back to players who got big paychecks like CJ McCollum, who's in this trade. Where as soon as he signed one of like his latest extension, everyone looked around saying that ain't worth it. That's just way too much money for a limited dimensional player. Because it's not just your team gets expensive. That's, again, I have no sympathy for expensive teams. But as you're trying to win a championship, the CBA is designed that if you're expensive, it doesn't just cost your owner money, it reduces what other players you can bring around you. And if you suddenly get really expensive with Keontae, George, Larry Markin, and Walker Kessler, because you gave them all $40 million plus. Like, no, Kessler's not going to make $40 million plus. But let's say between the three of them, like the three of them alone cost $125 million, right? Because you'd have Lowry at some sort of 50 plus mark and Keontae at some sort of 30 plus mark or 40 plus mark, and then you have Kessler at 30 plus. Like you end up with $120 million for three guys. None of them who are stars and all of whom have flaws. And you're limited to, okay, based on their three skill sets, a championship NBA team is missing a dozen skills that those three players don't have, right? And so you need to add players to play with them because of their dimensions. Like as much as I've lauded, as much as I've lauded Lowry on his modularity with a number of different teams, still not a guy you can just give the ball to and say dribble. So like that's a flaw, right? He's not like these LeBron James, Kawhi Leonard type swingmen where he just does everything well. There are things he can't do. We obviously know there are things that Keontae can't do yet and Kessler can't do yet. So we're seeing Atlanta, obviously they were fortunate. I think they were fortunate to have Washington. Even in, we can tell a joke like, oh, they're fortunate to have Washington in the league so they can dump Trae Young onto them. No, I think Washington has been operating really intelligently for the past couple years. They wouldn't have done this deal unless they actually had a real basketball and strategic need for Trae Young. So I think Atlanta is very fortunate that there was any team at all who had a strategic need for Trae Young. So with the troubles that Atlanta is having with that they were having with the Trae Young trade, Utah's got to be really careful with how much money they give players that are limited in what lineups they can play in. Or, as I mentioned about Trae Young, it's not saying like someone like Kessler isn't a very good player, but if you're signing Kessler to X amount of large salary, it takes X percent of players in the rest of the NBA who can't play for your team anymore. Obviously, I think Kessler is more modular than Trae Young. And if you sign a starting center, it just takes away the other starting centers, capable players that you want to bring in. So it's not that limited, but he's someone that you have to be conscious about your spacing. If there's some sort of okay shooting swingman who's incredible at defense and you're willing to pay $20 million for him, you really don't want to play him with Kessler. You really don't. You're not closing a lineup with that mystery swingman and Kessler. Pretend with me for a moment that Cody Williams actually becomes something. But that something ends up not being a three-point shooter. Dude shooting like 13% from three this year. Apparently the shot is just not a thing. But he actually becomes this ace defender and slasher and passer. Had 4 assists today against Dallas. That's a player you can't play with Kessler a lot. Can't have 2 non-shooters in today's NBA out there. Can't have it. You might be able to get away with that in a random regular season game. Sure, that's fine. Can't get away with it in playoff basketball. So there's not like a direct connection to like, oh, Trae Young to the Jazz, although I will say the Jazz probably sniffed around before in last offseason before Keontae blew up, and now we're all thrilled about it. And like there's just no way that Keontae and Trae Young are a thing together, of course. But what I'm more interested in as a Jazz fan and in the NBA at large, I think we really got to look at the rest of the NBA on this too, is establishing a team that can have multiple $20 million players and everyone kind of being okay with that and saying, if you're a star, if you're an all NBA guy, here's the $50 million plus. If you're a star and modular, I should say, right? Because Trae Young made his all-star games. I think we're going to see a number of all-stars in the years to come who have flaws. But if you're not really sniffing the all-star conversation, or if you're sniffing it in a way like Keontae George is, where it's like, oh yeah, he's an honorable mention all-star, then there needs to be some sort of like $30 million range that like all these people have to be comfortable with. Yes, it becomes fraught when you're doing restricted free agency, where you're doing the extension discussions before you get to restricted free agency. You're talking to 22, 23, 24-year-olds who are ready for their first big payday. And because they're so young and full of whatever potential you can come up with, it's very easy for the teams to just bend over for the agents. I'm looking at Orlando as a big example here. They give Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner a ton of money. They're going to be in deep shit. Both Wagner and Banchero are probably going to be decent players. Banchero doesn't particularly look like a terribly positive player right now. Wagner gets hurt a little bit, and he has his own shooting issues. But they got mega bucks. I love what Houston did with Jabari Smith. They fought with Jabari Smith to get a lower amount on his extension. And I still think it was too high, because you're paying money for potential. Jabari Smith has been pretty okay. He's improving year over year. Defense is looking a little bit better over the past couple years under Udoka. You're paying $40 million for a nice starter who could become a star. I'm not saying I want these guys to prove it first. It just feels a little expensive now, because you can end up in a Trae Young situation that really doesn't feel appropriate. It doesn't feel appropriate. So, I'll conclude. I don't have a natural conclusion to this idea. But the Trae Young situation should be a warning to anyone who needs to start paying their young players. And especially if those young players are not modular and flexible, where you can really build a lot of different interesting teams around them. If you need to neuter how you build your team because you gave him $50 million, then you're in trouble. I don't think the Jazz are in trouble by giving Lauri Markkanen the extension they gave. I think they could paint themselves into a really big problem if they gave Kessler everything he asked for. $35 million. Man, you might have to be comfortable with being a $21 million player. Make a few all-defense teams, and get paid on your next contract. The NBA salary cap is just not kind to that. If you don't time up your salaries right. So we'll see. I've spoken way too long about this topic than I thought. Because I do want to talk about the Jazz rotation and some quirks I've noticed. So we'll start on today's game against the Dallas Mavericks. I really thought I had a handle on things. And then, so the Jazz don't have Jusuf Nurkic tonight. They rested Svi Mykhailiuk. So you're thinking, okay, this might... the Jazz have been playing Cody Williams more. They've been playing Taylor Hendricks more. Their minutes are going to go on the uptick. We know what happens when Jusuf Nurkic sits. We'll start Kevin Love in his place. If for some reason we don't have either Kevin Love and Jusuf Nurkic, I think that's only happened once this season. They'll figure out like a Kyle Filipowski or a Taylor Hendricks to sort of round out that starting lineup. But tonight was just no Nurkic, no Svi, also no Ace Bailey, who has an actual injury, but I don't think affects this rotation discussion too much. I think he does in the broader scheme of things, but not for the discussion I'm trying to think about tonight. The Jazz have so I get a lot of comments saying like we have no idea what the Jazz rotation is going to be night to night, just no idea. So what is predictable and what is unpredictable about the Jazz lineup right now? For one, it's the Kevin Love starting. You're going to get that. I think that's a recent development over the past 3 or 4 weeks, but you look at these things in stages. And you also look at how the schedule is shaking out. They are going to rest players who are a little bit older to make sure that they're fresh for the season-long thing. Jusuf Nurkic has a long injury history. That we want to be a little bit careful with him. And then if his backup is a 98-year-old Kevin Love, you also need to be careful with him and make sure that they're playing appropriately. Appropriate minutes. They haven't started Kyle Anderson this year, but he has served as a lot of backup center type of situations. We've mentioned that in the past, that Kyle Filipowski and Taylor Hendricks are just completely ill-equipped to actually play backup center. In the past few weeks, the past week or so, the Jazz have been toying around with a 3-forward lineup of Hendricks, Filipowski, and Markkanen. Just get some sort of size out there. I really like that lineup because I don't think it's any good, and you don't actually have a center out there, and that's kind of a problem. But I really think you can't just have 2 of those 3 forwards out there. You need to have even more just like lineup base size, even if you don't have that one guy who is good at organizing a defense from the 5. Like Kyle Anderson is not great at it, but he can do it. So what's predictable is you're going to get this Kevin Love thing, but what's notable is that Kevin Love doesn't close any of these games. He plays for 6 to 8 minutes, maybe like 4 to 8 minutes at the start of every quarter in these games. So that's predictable quirk number 1. Kevin Love is going to start. When he starts, he's going to play the first 4 to 6 minutes of every one of these quarters. And he's never closing these games. I think he had that one explosion a few weeks ago, and he closed that game. That's going to be the rare outlet there. The other thing is that, especially with Ace out, with his injuries, if the team is resting Svi Mykhailiuk, and the team is like without Ace Bailey, or if they're without Bryce Sensabaugh, or if there's some other guard is having an issue, they're going to rotate who gets to play with Keontae and Lowry. I think we've seen for a long time that Will Hardy's wants to see how players respond in certain situations, certain lineups, and players who frankly just haven't looked that good. What happens if you put them in a more productive lineup where they're asked to do a little bit less, but also asked to do a lot more, making sure that the big guys get the balls and get the shots and all that good stuff? And today, Cody Williams got to start. He got a start alongside Bryce Sensabaugh, Lauri Markkanen, Keontae George, and of course Kevin Love, which I just mentioned. And Cody Williams looked terrific. Walk that back a little bit. He looked very good. It wasn't terrific, but he was very good. And so I think a lot of that product is playing with the good players. Back in my fledgling soccer career, it always just felt like I was a better player who could make easier decisions when I was playing with better players. It just, the game felt a lot slower to me when a pass I was trying to make or some sort of dribble move I was trying to make was going to lead to some sort of fruitful event. And I think that like players like Cody Williams, who is more of a connector by nature, that's going to be who he is in the NBA. It feels more natural for him if he can be the fifth guy connecting things and slashing and defending and we started him last year, remember. If he can do that rather than have too much dependency on the second unit. I bemoaned his bad G League stats, and perhaps he's being asked to do too much. So the Jazz are going to kind of rotate who gets the nod in those situations. But then the other quirk that I've noticed, and I think this is the best quirk about the Jazz over the past 7 games. This is my favorite stat. It's not even a stat, but Walt Clayton Jr. He's been in the closing lineup for 7 games in a row. He's been in the closing lineup for 7 games in a row. He's obviously not started any of those games. In all 7 of these games that he has closed, he's also been the last player off the bench. The 9th or 10th guy. He basically plays a huge swath of the second quarter, and he'll play like the entire fourth quarter. Such an odd little lineup quirk. I think that's really interesting. This is 7 games in a row. This isn't just like I'm not cherry picking like 4 out of 7. This is 7 games in a row, which means it's something that is part of the actual plan. Saying like, hey, we're obviously starting Keontae and 2 shooting. Like Keontae's going to play capital P point guard. Going to play him with a couple swingmen. Going to play him with Lowry, and we're going to play him with Yusuf or Kevin. Like that's the starting lineup, and that's another predictable thing to go for. Like Keontae, 2 shooting-ish or defensive swingmen. Ace Bailey, Bryce Sensabaugh, Taylor Hendricks, Cody Williams. Like those are the swingmen. Lowry at the 4, Kevin Love or Yusuf Nurkic. It's predictable. Then the Jazz love for the immediate substitution to be Isaiah Collier to take some of the ball handling pressure off Keontae. But don't sub out Keontae. Bring in Isaiah Collier from typically his backcourt mate. And then when Keontae goes out and Isaiah Collier's still on the floor, you bring in Walt Clayton. Occasionally, it'll be straight up Keontae, bring in Isaiah to play with Keontae, and then when Keontae goes off the floor, sometimes it's not even Walt Clayton coming back in until a little bit later. That part can be a little messy afterwards, but it's not like Isaiah Collier comes in with Walt Clayton. But Walt Clayton is always playing in that like huge swaths of the second quarter, but he doesn't come in ahead of Isaiah Collier. He's playing more minutes than Collier, typically. And he's closing entire fourth quarters. It's wild to me. Lauri Markkanen's minutes have been through the roof. Through the roof, Lowry's minutes have been. I think this is a pre-All-Star push to juice his numbers, to make his numbers look as good as possible before All-Star selections. And then after the All-Star, even the selections, then they'll cool down the minutes because we don't want to hurt that dude long term. The things that just made me tilt my head a little bit. So those are the predictable things I think you can look for. Is like actually Walt Clayton is playing a lot of minutes, just he's coming in the rotation a little bit more than usual. Isaiah Collier has a pretty reliable backup point guard role where he's just playing pure point guard. And rarely is Walt Clayton really asked to be the point guard. He's really just playing more of an off-ball role at this point. I feel like there was one other consistent thing I wanted to mention. And it's just like Kyle Filipowski. If this is a Kevin Love night, you're gonna get some Filipowski, and he's gonna play quote unquote backup center. But it's really just trying to hodgepodge around whatever players they have. And Filipowski's not playing a ton of minutes for a reason. And then the Jazz throws for a loop today. So without Svi Mykhailiuk, you get a little bit more of a quirky thing. Kyle Anderson's going to play today. Okay, that's fine. The first half, he comes in after 8 minutes of action, and he plays the first 6 minutes of the second quarter. So he plays 12, 14 minutes in the first half in one stretch, bridging the first and second quarters. Okay, could use you out there. That's fine. In the first half, though, Taylor Hendricks comes in, plays for 4 minutes at the end of the first quarter, doesn't start the second quarter. So he only gets a little 4-minute stint. Actually, 2-minute stint. I'm sorry. Misread this. So he plays for 2 minutes at the end of the first quarter. Shoots, makes a 3. Shot 2 threes. Makes one of them. Doesn't start the second quarter, though, which felt weird to me. It said Bryce Sensabaugh comes back in for him. Or I'm sorry, no, it's Kevin Love comes in, right? So it's the big man coming in for the ostensibly a big man here. I'm just looking at my notes here. But then they give him a chance to come in 4 minutes later. 3 minutes later. So at the 9-minute mark of the second quarter, they bring him back in. But then he only plays a minute and a half. Takes 2 threes, misses 2 threes. He gets a couple rebounds in there. He gets an offensive rebound that was notable. I didn't think he did anything notable. It must have been something that in the coaching report, the scouting report, that they talked about in shoot around or on film or something, that he just did not do. The reason I say that is he doesn't play the rest of the game. So he gets 1 2-minute stint, 1 minute and a half stint, all in the first half, and then he doesn't play again. This is not the only time Will Hardy has done this to Taylor Hendricks, where he gets like a spot little bit of minutes in the first half and then just doesn't play. Didn't make any sense to me. This is coupled with the fact, and maybe this is maybe a tanking move, Kyle Anderson plays the last 18 minutes of the game straight. I have a couple theories. I'm sorry, it's 16 minutes. Last 16 and a half minutes of the game. He plays straight. I have a couple theories on this. One, I want to dispel any sort of notion that I know a lot of you have, being like, Kyle Anderson is a good player, and by playing Kyle Anderson, we were trying to win. But Kyle Anderson is the opposite at this point in his career. Kyle Anderson is a player you want out there to lose your basketball game. Of course, every time Kyle Anderson seems to play recently, he has a decent game. So I certainly just don't think that Utah is looking at Kyle Anderson thinking like, oh man, this guy's too good. We can't play him. Guys, Kyle Anderson, he's not good. I think the bigger issue you're seeing is more of a selection bias thing, because we're only playing Kyle Anderson against sketchier, mediocre to bad teams where Utah has more of a need to try to play their bad players so that they have a better chance to lose the games. Like Dallas is a very mediocre team, and when the Jazz were in danger of winning this game, they said, all right, we'll just play Kyle Anderson out there to try to lose. But Kyle Anderson is only getting minutes against bad teams. So it's making him look good. But he plays the last 16 minutes of the game. And Taylor Hendricks doesn't touch the court in the second half. And Cody Williams, I mentioned that he looked good in the start today. He's looked really competent out there for the past. He's getting a lot of fast break dunks and slashing dunks, and he had a stare down dunk the other night. He doesn't get above the rim as much as I'd expect him to, but he's starting to finish a little bit more confidently. He's not flailing and falling to the ground as much. Anyways, like tonight, he has a promising start. Starts the game, finishes the first half, starts the second half. Doesn't come in the fourth quarter. Kyle Anderson plays the entire fourth quarter. And whether it's Cody Williams or Taylor Hendricks, it's just odd to me to see Kyle Anderson playing the whole fourth quarter when you have the Williams and Hendricks options. I'm not going to have arguments over, like, okay, if Kyle Anderson played 4 or 6 minutes in the fourth quarter and Cody Williams or Taylor Hendricks played the rest, I think that's not worth writing home about. But for him to play the entire fourth quarter, also a lot of it with Kevin Love. This is part of what you've heard us talk about in this podcast a number of times is Kyle Anderson is playing like this backup 5 role. He wasn't today. He did not come in for Kevin Love. He played alongside Kevin Love. In the third quarter, it was a mass substitution where Kevin Love, Cody Williams, and Lauri Markkanen all took a seat on the bench. They were replaced by Isaiah Collier, Kyle Filipowski, and Kyle Anderson. So maybe you can say Kyle Anderson's filling in for Kevin Love in that situation, but then to start the fourth quarter, Kevin Love comes back in. As I mentioned, that's a stable, consistent thing that always happens. And Kyle Anderson was still out there. And yeah, he's not a center, so it's obviously he is. You can do a number of different things with Kyle Anderson. One of the things I was perhaps too optimistic on before the season was I felt like he provided ball handling juice that the team just didn't have. I underrated Keontae, I underrated Isaiah Collier, and I underrated Lauri Markkanen, actually, on that front. So it was a weird story of Kyle Anderson tonight that I just didn't appreciate. But Walt Clayton, once again, does 10th guy off the bench. Plays 9 minutes in the second quarter, plays the entire fourth quarter. And he's a plus 10 in a great game. So this is the first time I've been frustrated with Will Hardy a little bit, is to, Nurkic. There was a great quote from Yusuf Nurkic last week about how he feels Will Hardy is patient with Nurkic. And you need to be a very patient overall coach if you're also going to deploy aggressive yelling in the mid-game, right? As we've seen Will Hardy do. Your players need to trust that you are going to be patient with them or they'll tune you out entirely. And Taylor Hendricks in particular, I think, is being yanked around a little bit in favor, and not in favor of flip minutes or Cody minutes that we can kind of get. They're in favor of the stuff like this. And that's not immediately inspiring to me. So when you think about like the Jazz rotation from night to night, I think when it comes to your main guys and some of your more stable bench guys like Kevin Love and Walt Clayton, I think there are stable roles for them. I think Bryce Sensabaugh has moved into a stable minutes allotment, even if Bryce Sensabaugh, the times of the game that he plays is oscillating wildly back and forth. He's started a bunch, he's come off the bench a bunch. It kind of depends on what the matchup is. But based on the health of the roster right now, he's now played his way into a reliable 25 minutes, whether he starts or not. And all these other guys, like Collier, if he's having a bad turnover day, he's not consistently playing 20 minutes, but he is going to be the first backup point guard off the bench. Kyle Filipowski, what game was it that he only played a handful of minutes? It was recently where he really didn't play that much. I want to say it was the Celtics game, maybe. I forget which game it was that he just did not play a ton of minutes, and there was a good reason for it because he did not look good. Anyways, no, it was the Oklahoma City game where he played 4 minutes or 4 or 5 minutes in the first half and doesn't touch the court the rest of the game. He actually had a very similar situation in Taylor Hendricks that I just mentioned, where he plays a few minutes in the first quarter, doesn't close the quarter, and then comes in for a couple minutes in the second quarter and then never plays again. I thought that was unusual. Against Oklahoma City, it goes into another coaching point, I suppose. When you're playing like the top echelon of teams, like, you got to give Will Hardy a little bit of leeway on like just figuring out what's going to work. Like, you have to be a little bit modular on the rotation. It's not just like this is who's going to play when and that's it. Especially against the good teams, you have to be way more. I think I've said the word modular 100 times in this podcast. So Filipowski was just against any matchup just didn't look good. That's totally fine. It just, the Hendricks part of it today just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so, the Jazz play 11 guys against Oklahoma City, in part because they needed to give Ace Bailey some return to action minutes, in part because of whatever they felt like they needed for Kyle Filipowski versus Taylor Hendricks. Cody Williams is getting burned, so they have to have minutes for him, especially against Jalen Williams. So once again, I come to not a neat conclusion here, but there are some specific takeaways that you can have with the Jazz lineup from night to night. Yusuf Nurkic is typically also going to close these games, unlike Kevin Love. Nurkic being on the floor or not does not affect whether Clayton's closing these games, because Clayton is always closing these games, interestingly. And you're going to get 40-plus minutes out of Lauri Markkanen before the All-Star game. Perhaps out of Keontae. They've been a little bit easy with Keontae as well. They haven't played him 40 tons of minutes, but he's playing high 30s reliably. Major shout-out to Keontae for the Dallas win today. I think Lauri Markkanen was the star of the show with his 33 and 7. 4 assists for Lauri Markkanen. 2 blocks, 3 turnovers. But Keontae George with 37 minutes, 19 points, which seems like, it's not a lot. 8 of 12 from the field. The reason he didn't get a ton of points is because he was only 2 of 3 from the free throw line. So if he's not getting those good free throws, he's not getting up to 25, 26 points. But 19 points on 8 of 12 shooting, very good percentage. 7 assists, okay, that's pretty good for him. 0 turnovers, 3 steals. Hell yeah, Keontae George, that's awesome. Just kind of looking at, Isaiah Collier, 7 points, 6 assists. Okay, good backup point guard, 4 turnovers. Can't happen, man. So I just wanted to mention that quickly as something I really appreciate about Keontae's game tonight was 0 turnovers and 7 assists and 3 steals from our starting point guard. So I hope my long diatribes about Trae Young and the Jazz lineup, the rotations, spoke to you a little bit. I'm hoping we get clarity on the rotation as far as like getting Taylor Hendricks and Cody Williams a little bit more spot. Dan Clayton wrote some notes about their presence in the rotation recently as well. Ace Bailey's health is going to throw a wrench in these things too. The Kyle Anderson minutes just don't make a lot of sense to me, unlike my praise for Svi Mikhailiuk in the past. So I hope that there are some consistent things that you can look to as a Jazz fan or a fantasy basketball player or something like that. Something worth monitoring going forward for sure. And now that we have some trends, I'm sure Will Hardy will throw us for a loop. That's been a lot today. More exciting trade deadline preview stuff ahead for Salt City Hoops. Can't wait to get into it with you, my friends, to talk about the Jazz at the trade deadline. And the NBA at the trade deadline. Always a fun thing. I think the Jazz are going to be very active. As we've always said, it's a hell of a good thing to have basketball management who are on the phone with all the teams. They're not passive. We do not have passive management. They'll be on the phones. Even if nothing happens, you know that they will have tried. All right, that's it for me, Mark Pereira and Salt City Hoops. We will catch you next week. Good night.